So just to go through some of the rules with the 1031 exchange, the dentist that's selling the practice,
Mhm.
the date he goes to closing and now sold the practice, within 45 days of that date, they have to identify what they're going to use as a replacement property.
Mhm.
And then within 180 days of the day they went to closing, they have to close on the new property. You have to meet those strict criteria, because if you
And
miss
just
it
to
by
clarify,
one
John,
day,
sorry, when you selling the practice building, right? Not the specific practice, the real estate part.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, you cannot do a 1031 exchange with the practice,
Mhm.
just the practice office building. So 1031 exchange only relates to real estate. Believe it or not, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, you could have done a 1031 exchange even with a dental practice. They
Oh,
allowed
wow.
you to
I
do
didn't
that
know
with
that.
practices and any business for that matter, but you had to buy another business with that money.
Okay.
That's no longer allowed, but they still protected the real estate aspect of the 1031 exchange, luckily. And it's a terrific tax saving strategy. So there are strict rules you got to follow. And one thing I forgot to mention to you before is that, these are huge advantages to the owner of the dental practice that also owns the real estate.
Mhm.
But I've seen dentists say that, the dentist practice owner wants to sell me the practice, but they don't want to sell the real estate because
Yeah.
they don't want to
Yep.
pay the tax on it.
Right.
Well, if you bring to their attention, look, there's 1031 exchange and other things you can do, and have them speak to a tax smart advisor, then that dentist who's hesitating from selling the practice,
Yep.
the building within
Building.
the practice,
Mhm.
what he's going to do is he's going to say, you know what, it may make sense.
Mhm.
Let me just sell both. And that is a win-win, again, for the dental practice buyer and the seller as well. So
I'm
in
sorry,
the
I interrupted
world
you.
of,
You were saying the 45 days of identifying, and then that's when I had interrupted you there. So sorry. Back to the other time point you were mentioning.
sure. So once you go to contract, you have a legal obligation to sell that property. The key date that we're concerned about is the date to go to closing. So once you sell that property, and that money is basically exchanged,
Mhm.
at that closing, you nor your lawyer is allowed to touch that money. You can't
Mhm.
get the check. That money has to go to what's called a qualified intermediary.
Mhm.
Generally, that's a title company or yet another lawyer. They have to hold that money in escrow for you, because once you take possession of that money, all bets are off. 1031 exchange doesn't work. So it's critically important you get a qualified intermediary that will step in, collect the check, hold that money in escrow for you until you're ready to buy the replacement property.
So just to be
That's
clear, you
day
can't
one.
get paid out at the closing and then call your attorney or your accountant and say, "Oh, I want to do a 1031 exchange with this check." You cannot do that.
Exactly. And again, have I gotten calls like that in the past? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. So it goes back to rule number one: planning, planning, planning. Right? If you're
Yeah.
not planning, not talking, you can't get tax advice after the fact. It
Mhm.
doesn't work that way. You have to get tax advice before you engage in a transaction. Critically important. So now it's the closing day. Money is released. The qualified intermediary takes that money, holds on to it until you're ready to buy the replacement property. But that's also the day the 45-day period starts to run.
Okay.
So within 45 days, in writing, you have to notify your qualified intermediary, I'm interested in using that money to buy either property A, B, C, whatever it is. So you want to give them a number of different things you're thinking about buying.
And it can be multiple properties.
You can also have multiple properties. There's a
Mhm.
few different rules there that are a little complicated. I won't get into the details, but generally you could identify 3 properties, but you could also identify more than 3 properties. There's a whole other rule. I'm not going to get into it here
Okay.
today,
Yeah.
but we're going to make sure you talk to your tax advisor about that.
Yep.
So within that 45 days, if you identify, I may buy property A, B, or C, you met that part of the requirement, but now you have to close on the purchase of one or more of those properties you identify.
Mhm.
And that closing has to be within 180
90
days
days.
of when you close. So
Yep.
just less than 6 months you have throughout that whole process.
Okay.
So this is not an easy concept, but if utilized correctly, tremendous game changer. Again, the example I gave, the doctor could have lost close to half, let's call it 40% of the money in taxes.
Mhm.
Now the beneficiary could potentially have not only paid no tax on that, but no tax on all other future appreciation. If you want to leave a legacy to your children, this is a great way to do it. You know, it just makes an awful lot of sense.